There is a certain silence that surrounds a woman who walks alone, not because she is unloved, but because she has chosen to listen more deeply to the voice within. In a world where connection is often confused with dependency, let's say where validation is sought from the presence of others, there exists a woman who chooses solitude not as escape, but as empowerment. She is not defined by who walks beside her, but by the unwavering steadiness of her own steps. To live alone is not to be lonely. It is to cultivate inner harmony, to reclaim your time, your space, your thoughts. And to walk without the attachments of fleeting relationships is not a sign of weakness, but of great restraint and profound clarity. Let's say the strength of such a woman does not lie in resistance to love, but in the understanding that true love cannot blossom until the roots of self-respect and self-awareness run deep. This is not a rejection of intimacy, it is the refinement of it, a discipline that begins from within, much like martial arts, let's say, where the greatest victories are invisible to the world, but deeply transformative to the one who trains. Let us now explore not the absence of someone, but the presence of self. This is the power of a woman living alone, unchained from the need for approval, grounded in silence, and radiating a strength that few can understand, but many will feel. Solitude is not a void, it is sacred space for self-mastery. When a woman chooses to live alone, without the habitual distractions of romantic attachments, she does not enter into an empty silence. She steps into a deeper listening, a more refined awareness. In this stillness, the outer noise begins to fade and the inner voice grows stronger. And that voice is not the one filled with doubt or stories from the past. It is a voice that has been waiting patiently for her to slow down long enough to hear its wisdom. To be alone is to allow oneself to confront the mind without escape. When no one is texting, calling, or demanding attention, all the masks can be removed. What remains is the raw presence of the self. It is in this state that true transformation becomes possible. It is not about cutting off from the world, but about becoming more attuned to one's inner landscape. In that silence, she meets herself. Let's say she begins to see the places she once ignored, the wounds she once patched over with affection, and the fears she once tried to bury beneath companionship. Every emotion that arises is no longer filtered through the lens of someone else's perception. There is no need to perform. There is no pressure, compromise, or shrink to maintain peace. Instead, there is a return to authenticity. The woman living alone begins to recognize what truly belongs to her, her preferences, her rhythms, her priorities. She becomes the architect of her own space and the curator of her own energy. No longer shaped by the desires or habits of others, she becomes refined by solitude. Self-mastery is not control. It is understanding. It is seeing oneself clearly in the mirror of daily life and choosing to respond rather than react. Without the emotional turbulence that often comes from entanglements, there is room to observe thoughts, track patterns, and refine the impulses that once ran unchecked. She begins to understand her triggers, her shadows, her tendencies, not to judge them, but to know them. And in knowing them, she begins to rise above them, let's say. There is great power in a routine built entirely around one's own growth. The morning becomes a sacred practice, not rushed or dictated by another's timeline. Meals are taken in mindfulness, prepared with care, not obligation. The body is moved not for appearance but for vitality. The home becomes a temple, clean, quiet, intentional. In every small choice, she is training herself, not in discipline enforced by rules, but in devotion guided by inner clarity. The absence of romantic distractions clears the path for deeper pursuits. She can read for hours without interruption, dive into spiritual study, meditate in silence, and walk with the wind as her only companion. These are not signs of isolation but indicators of integration. She is no longer running from herself. She is returning to herself. Her time is no longer borrowed. It is fully hers. And in owning her time, she begins to honor her energy. She learns where it flows freely and where it is drained. She sees the value of her presence and she protects it like a sacred flame. When no one else is around to validate her, she becomes her own source of affirmation. Not through empty praise, but through the deep knowing that she is enough, not because of what she offers someone else, but because of who she is when no one is watching. This is the ground of true confidence. It does not rise from compliments or attention. It grows from consistency, from keeping one's word to oneself, from living in alignment with what is true. Solitude becomes a mirror. It reflects not just the light but also the shadows. And she welcomes both. For without facing the shadow, mastery is incomplete. She learns to sit with discomfort, to breathe through the urge to distract, and to soften into the moments that once triggered escape. Each breath becomes a form of training. Each quiet night becomes an opportunity for recalibration. Slowly, the woman begins to embody a kind of power that is not loud but undeniable. A presence that does not demand attention but commands respect. She begins to see life not in terms of what is missing but in terms of what is essential. She no longer looks outward for completion. She does not romanticize chaos or seek drama for stimulation. Her nervous system rests. Her body heals. Her thoughts clear. She becomes sharp not through struggle, but through serenity. She is no longer entangled in another's projections or caught in cycles of pleasing and apologizing. She simply is, fully, completely. The wisdom that arises from such solitude cannot be taught in books or courses. It must be lived. Let's say it must be earned through hours of honest reflection and gentle refinement. She begins to understand the nature of energy, the subtleties of presence, the quiet power of non-reaction. She becomes like water, calm, deep, adaptive, and essential. Her boundaries are no longer walls of defense, but rivers of clarity that guide others on how to approach her. She does not chase. She does not cling. She does not perform. She simply radiates. Her strength is not in how many battles she fights, but in how few she entertains. Her value is not in being chosen, but in choosing herself. She no longer measures her worth by external attention, but by internal peace. In a world that often pushes women to be needed, to be partnered, to be defined by their roles in others' lives, she reclaims her role as the center of her own. And with this centeredness comes freedom. Freedom from comparison, from competition, from craving. She is not interested in being better than anyone. She is interested in being more of herself. This kind of woman does not fear solitude because she has discovered the treasure hidden within it. She does not fear time alone because she knows how to use it wisely. She is no longer lonely because she has become her own sanctuary. Her solitude is not empty. It is sacred space for self-mastery. A woman without external attachments reclaims her emotional sovereignty. In a world that often equates fulfillment with romantic involvement, a woman who steps away from that narrative is making more than a personal choice. She is undertaking a silent rebellion. She chooses to no longer outsource her emotional well-being to others. She no longer hands over the keys to her peace in exchange for temporary affection. Instead, she takes full ownership of her inner world. She begins to understand that dependency, even in its subtle forms, is the root of instability. What once felt like love, in many instances, was a transaction of need. And in choosing to walk without that exchange, she begins the real journey of liberation. Emotional sovereignty is not about being closed off or cold. It is the art of remaining open while also being anchored. It is about knowing when to receive and when to retreat. It is about not losing oneself in the tides of another person's chaos. A sovereign woman does not allow her joy to rise and fall based on someone else's presence or absence. She has studied her own emotional terrain. She knows where her valleys lie, where her rivers run deep, and where the sun always rises again. She no longer seeks permission to feel whole. She simply is. This kind of strength comes not from denying desire, but from transforming it. Let's say she does not pretend that she doesn't long for connection, but she also refuses to settle for connection that comes at the cost of her peace. She refuses to sacrifice her clarity, her rhythm, or her values to maintain something that shakes her core. This is the wisdom that emerges when a woman takes time to unlearn the conditioning that taught her love means sacrifice, that worthiness is tied to being desired, and that loneliness is something to run from. She stops running. She starts sitting. She starts observing. She starts listening. Without external attachments, there is space for discernment. She sees the patterns she once repeated. She sees the role she once played, rescuer, fixer, pleaser, and she realizes none of those masks were ever her essence. They were performances written by pain. And now, she no longer needs an audience for that script. She puts down the costume. She breathes into her truth. She recognizes that love, in its purest form, does not deplete, does not demand. It does not distort. And until such love appears, she is not willing to compromise her kingdom. Reclaiming emotional sovereignty also means embracing responsibility. She stops blaming others for her sadness or frustration. She stops waiting for apologies that may never come. She no longer hinges her healing on someone else's growth. Instead, she becomes deeply responsible for her own reactions, her own boundaries, her own healing. This is not always gentle work. It requires a level of maturity that many avoid. It asks for honesty, patience, and the willingness to sit in discomfort without reaching for distraction. But through this fire, she is refined. The woman who walks without attachments learns to hold space for herself. When grief arises, she doesn't rush to numb it. When fear whispers, she doesn't drown it in attention. She becomes her own witness, her own guide, her own healer. She finds rituals that ground her, practices that nourish her, and wisdom that aligns her. Her relationship with herself deepens. And from that depth, new clarity emerges. She begins to recognize what is true and what is illusion. She no longer falls for empty promises or shiny facades. Her discernment sharpens, not from bitterness, but from presence. In this space of inner clarity, she becomes magnetic, not in the way that seeks to attract attention, but in the way that exudes authenticity. People begin to feel the calm she carries, the peace that cannot be faked, the light that doesn't flicker when someone leaves. She is no longer seeking wholeness in someone else's eyes. She has found it in her own reflection. This changes everything. The conversations she entertains shift. The boundaries she sets become non-negotiable. The standard she holds is no longer dictated by loneliness, but by self-respect. She no longer enters spaces hoping to be accepted. She brings acceptance with her. She no longer tolerates disrespect in the name of love. She has learned that true love begins with honoring oneself. The woman who walks alone is not a victim of circumstance. She is a creator of her inner environment. And in that inner environment, peace is not accidental. It is intentional. It is the result of choices made each day to protect what is sacred and to release what is not. Even when faced with temptations to return to old patterns, she pauses, she breathes. She remembers who she has become. She does not allow loneliness to trick her into self-abandonment. She has learned that being alone is not the same as being empty. In fact, she is more full now than she ever was when she was seeking outside of herself. She is full of self-awareness, of gentleness, of depth. She does not need to be constantly entertained or reassured. Her presence is enough. Her silence is healing. Her solitude is her sanctuary. This sovereignty is not loud. It does not need to be proven. It is felt in how she walks, how she speaks, how she rests. It is felt in the way she honors her energy, in the way she moves away from drama, in the way she chooses peace over proving. She is not hard, but she is firm. She is not indifferent, but she is selective. She gives love freely, but not blindly, and she receives love only when it meets her with the same depth she offers herself. There is no desperation in her gaze, let's say no grasping in her touch. She has tasted her own strength and it has become her foundation. She no longer fears being misunderstood. She no longer needs to be constantly seen to know she matters. Her validation is internal. Her confidence is not inflated. It is rooted. Rooted in experience, in pain transmuted into wisdom, in tears transformed into clarity. She no longer looks for someone to save her, to fill her, to define her. She is the source. She is the anchor. She is the flame. To reclaim emotional sovereignty is not to deny the beauty of love, but to recognize that the truest love will never ask her to betray herself. And until that love comes, if it ever comes, she remains whole and she remains free and she remains deeply connected to the one relationship that will carry her through every season of life, the one she has with herself. True strength arises not from isolation, but from inner alignment and clarity. When a woman chooses to live without romantic attachments, she is not isolating herself from the world, but choosing a path of deeper connection with her essence. Society often teaches that strength is loud, forceful, or aggressive. But real strength, the kind that lasts through storms and silence alike, comes quietly. It grows slowly. It is cultivated through self-awareness, through conscious choices, and through the willingness to live with intention rather than impulse. A woman who is aligned with herself does not need to prove her worth. Her very presence reflects it. In a world that often pulls attention outward, that bombards the senses with comparison and distraction, it becomes an act of power to pause, to center, and to return to what is real. This return is not dramatic or filled with declarations. It is a quiet recognition, a subtle shift inward. A woman who has found this alignment begins to walk differently. She is no longer reacting to the opinions of others and nor chasing the illusion of fulfillment through someone else's gaze. Her compass is internal. Her clarity is the map. She begins to trust the rhythm of her own soul, even when it does not match the expectations around her. Living without boyfriends, without the constant cycle of romantic highs and lows, allows space to explore this clarity in a raw and uninterrupted way. It is not a rejection of love, but a refinement of it. She is no longer interested in being consumed or consumed by someone else's chaos. She has tasted peace, and that peace has become her standard. She does not push people away, but she also does not pull them in from a place of emptiness. She remains open, but not unguarded. Her openness is a gift, not an entitlement, and only those who approach with respect and presence are invited into that space. Strength, when rooted in alignment, is unshakable. It does not depend on mood or circumstance. It is not reactive. It is responsive. It arises from a place within that knows what truly matters. This woman is not swayed by superficial charm or temporary attention. She does not measure herself by how many people desire her. She measures herself by how well she lives in integrity with her truth. That truth is not static, it evolves. And she evolves with it, shedding old versions of herself not out of shame, but out of reverence for her own growth. This inner strength is not about being emotionally numb. It is about being emotionally intelligent. She allows herself to feel deeply, but she does not drown in those feelings. She witnesses them. She honors them, and then she releases what does not serve. This process is not linear. It takes time. There are moments of doubt, moments of longing, moments of quiet tears shed in the dark. But even in those moments, she remains with herself. She does not run from the discomfort. She does not rush to fill the void. She breathes through it. She listens. And through that listening, as she deepens her trust in the wisdom of her own life. Inner alignment also means that her choices reflect her values. She no longer entertains connections that pull her out of balance. She no longer silences her intuition to maintain temporary peace. She does not abandon herself to be chosen. She understands that any bond that requires self-betrayal is not a bond. It is a burden, and she has laid those burdens down. In their place, she carries presence. She carries mindfulness. She carries a quiet knowing that she is exactly where she needs to be, and that whatever is meant for her will not ask her to shrink in order to receive it. This clarity influences everything. How she speaks, how she works, how she rests. She no longer moves out of guilt or fear, but from conscious intention. Her yes is wholehearted, and her no is firm and free of guilt. She is not easily manipulated because she knows her own mind. Let's say she is not easily persuaded by surface level charm because she sees through masks. This does not make her bitter. It makes her wise. She has walked through enough illusions to know what is real. And once she has found that realness within herself, she will not settle for less from anyone else. Her strength is reflected in her calm, in how she does not over-explain, in how she does not chase after what pulls away, in how she lets go with grace when something is no longer aligned. She is not interested in drama, in convincing, in begging. She stands rooted, and from that rootedness, she watches what is unstable fall away. Not as loss, but as alignment. What is meant for her will stay, not because she held tightly, but because it resonates with the truth of who she is. And what does not match that truth will quietly dissolve without resistance. Living without romantic distraction also brings clarity in relationships beyond romance. She sees who genuinely supports her growth and who only wanted access to her light. She becomes discerning with her time, with her energy, with her presence. She gives from overflow, not from depletion. She nurtures connections that are reciprocal, honest, and nourishing. She walks away from those that are draining, chaotic, or manipulative. Not with anger, but with peace. Not with blame, but with boundaries. The woman who lives inner alignment does not wait to be rescued. She does not fantasize about someone completing her. She is complete. She is not perfect, but she is whole. And that wholeness is magnetic, not because it seeks attention, but because it radiates authenticity. People feel safe around her because she is safe within herself. She does not promise what she cannot deliver. She does not pretend to be what she is not. She simply shows up, fully present, fully real. Even in solitude, she is never truly alone. She is accompanied by her clarity, her purpose, her presence. These are not things that can be bought or given. They are cultivated. They are earned through reflection, through inner work, through the courage to face what most avoid. This is not a path of avoidance. It is a path of refinement. She has chosen quality over quantity, depth over distraction, meaning over noise, and that choice has changed everything. This strength is not reserved for the few. It is available to anyone to turn inward and listen, anyone willing to slow down and unlearn, anyone willing to walk away from what feels familiar but no longer feels true. The woman who embodies this strength is not rare because she is special. Let's say, she is rare because she is willing to do what most fear. She is willing to meet herself fully and stand in that truth, regardless of who approves or understands. She is no longer guided by the fear of being alone because she has discovered the gift that lies within that very space.